Okay, good afternoon. So today I'm going to be looking at John Agard's poem Checking Out Me History, again talking you through the different methods that Agard uses, the effects that these methods create, and how he uses these methods to communicate his ideas. And that's what we're going to start off with today, just quickly recovering what Agard's ideas are, what he is using this poem as a vehicle to communicate. And I would argue that his central concept, the big idea that underpins all of this poem, is essentially this. I would argue that Agard uses this poem to challenge and critique what he calls a Eurocentric view of history that he feels he was taught in his time in the British education system. And what I mean by Eurocentric, and this is a word that Agard himself has used to describe the education system, is a curriculum which prioritises and which centres the experiences of white British people and which focuses primarily on white British historical figures. Now, the issue that Agard has with this is essentially that he views a historical and cultural education as a really significant part in shaping your own identity, and for him in shaping his identity. He argues in this poem, I think, that because black history and experience has historically been marginalised, has been pushed to the sides, that what was taught to him was irrelevant. He argues that only by discovering the historical and social achievements and accomplishments of black people can he himself develop a personal identity reflective of his culture and his roots. So Agard challenges us within this poem to question the way that history is taught and to examine the biases of a British curriculum, a curriculum which favours this Eurocentric view of history. To challenge these biases, Agard uses the italicised parts of the poem to shine a light on his significant black historical figures. So, let's have a look then at the way in which Agard uses this poem to communicate these ideas. So the first thing that you're going to notice within this poem, and the first thing that I think you really need to be thinking about and commenting on, is the way in which Agard writes. Dem tell me. And we see straight away that this is non-standard spelling. This is what we call phonetic spelling, which is spelling that reflects the way in which a word is pronounced. And he uses this phonetic spelling to represent his accent. Agard is of Afro-Guyanese descent, Guyana being in the Caribbean, so he uses this non-standard spelling in order to mimic his own accent, in order to represent the way that he speaks. So his identity runs throughout the heart of this poem, even in the way that he writes the words that he uses to begin this poem. So we also have the repetition in these first two lines. Dem tell me, what them want to tell me. And this repetition at the start of a line is referred to as anaphora, repetition at the beginning of successive lines of poetry. And it creates from the beginning a challenging tone, a sort of them versus me. This education is being done to him. He's being told something by an anonymous they, an anonymous them. So it creates this sense of immediately a bit of a power dynamic in the way that he views his education. He sees it as being something that is being done to him, told to him. And he gives us immediately in the third line the impression that actually this education is incomplete and it's biased. Them tell me what them want to tell me. He's being told what his educators want him to understand, what they want him to learn, regardless of whether or not it's relevant to him, regardless of whether or not it's a complete and well-rounded view of history. So straight away, we have this sense that the education he's receiving is incomplete. And it's biased. The repetition of this them creates that sense of frustration, I think, as well. So we could argue that this anaphora evokes a sense of frustration, and it also evokes, I think, a sense of a power dynamic, perhaps a hierarchy in the way that he sees his position in the education system. And we understand from these next two lines, this next short stanza, what he feels that this limited, biased view of history is effectively doing to him and his ability to perceive and understand the world around him. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to my own identity. So this first phrase here, bandage up, comes with all kinds of connotations of injury and wounding. It's as though his sight has been wounded. So connotes injury, but it also connotes restriction. And those are two different things. That sense of limitation, he is being blinded, his sight is being obscured. And this is exactly what we don't want education to do. A well-rounded curriculum, a good education should open your eyes up to the world around you. But he feels that his eyes are actively being closed, are being obscured, that his sight is being obscured. And then we have a slightly more violent form of language here. Blind me to my own identity. And again, this comes with a sense of almost of violence, as though this is something that he feels is physically painful to him and is harming him. So he uses the words my own history, my own identity, as if to say that these are the things that's being hidden from him. These are the things that are being taken away from him. So this stanza is used to suggest that his education is limited and his own history, his own cultural identity is being kept from him. Okay, so this third stanza, we get a little bit of a glimpse into what Agard actually is being taught. And we have a lot of juxtaposition used throughout these stanzas. There are several throughout the poem in which he juxtaposes, he contrasts the education that he is receiving with the education that he isn't receiving. And we start to understand this Eurocentric perspective that Agard uses the poem to critique and to criticise. So again, we have that use of anaphora at the beginning of these lines, them tell me, to repeat the things, this education that's being drummed into him. 1066 and all that, Dick Whittington and his cat. So it's this kind of blend of actual history here, but then also Dick Whittington and his cat. This is a nursery rhyme fairy tale figure. So this isn't a complete historical vision. It's a sort of blending together of white British history, but then also nursery rhymes, fairy tales, irrelevant to a real nuanced understanding of the world. So we have this contrast between the education he receives with, in the next two lines here, the education he is denied. Now, this is a poem that's absolutely rich with allusions, references to other historical, cultural and social figures of importance. So we have historical allusions, historical references in the lines 1066 and all that. And then to Dick Whittington and his cat. And then we come on to the first of these historical black figures that Agard is using this poem to discuss, Toussaint L'Ouverture. Now, Toussaint L'Ouverture was the leader of the Haitian Revolution, which was an uprising of slaves who overthrew colonial rule in 18th century Haiti. So this was under French rule at the time, and it was essentially a slave colony. Toussaint L'Ouverture was an incredibly charismatic and heroic figure who led this extraordinary uprising and liberated this entire community of people. So a heroic figure, and certainly someone that is worthy of further study, but someone who didn't feature in Agard's education. Now Agard, with his own identity being this blend of African and Guyanese, would have been particularly interested and is particularly interested in countries that have been under colonial rule and where colonial rule over time has been overthrown. And this is this first figure that is used to discuss those ideas. So, Toussaint L'Ouverture, leader of the Haitian Revolution. In the 18th century, who overthrew colonial rule, French colonial rule to be specific. Okay, so then we begin this first italicized portion of the poem, and this is used to just delve that little bit deeper into who this character was. And it's one of 3 separate italicized portions, italicized stanzas within the poem that do just give a little bit more background and a bit more detail into who these individuals were. So, Toussaint, a slave with vision, licked back Napoleon battalion and first Black Republic born. Toussaint, the thorn to the French. Toussaint, the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. And I just wanted to comment on 2 metaphors that are used within this poem. Here, Toussaint the thorn, and then secondly, Toussaint the beacon. So we get the sense here, the thorn, almost like the thorn in the side, like an irritant, like a frustration to French colonial rule. So he was someone who challenged authority and was heroic in the liberation of these people. So this is the metaphor which is used to suggest Toussaint's role in overthrowing the French authority. And then beacon. Now, a beacon is like a guiding light, and this is one of the first references that we have within the poem to this idea of light, which comes to represent, in my view, inspiration, optimism, and hope. So here he is represented as the beacon, the guiding light of the Haitian Revolution. So we could argue that this has connotations of hope, optimism, faith, and inspiration. And these hope and inspiration are the 2 there that I would really encourage you to focus on. Just like Toussaint offered hope to the people that he was helping to liberate, to the people that he was helping to free, he offers Agard a sense of inspiration, as Agard is unpacking and exploring and delving into what he perceives as important moments and important historical figures in the construction of his own identity. They offer him hope and inspiration as well. So he's also described as being a slave with vision. And this line about vision just echoes back here to the lines about how Agard feels that he doesn't have vision, he doesn't have sight. These things go together. As he's being blinded, as his sight is being obscured and his eyes are being bandaged up, this really contrasts with the images of light that are offered by these inspirational figures. And I think this is absolutely intentional, and I think it's a really effective way of exploring the idea that education, that understanding your history, your cultural identity, this is a process of shining a light, understanding and having a clear vision and information to use in the shaping of your identity. Okay, a slight tangent. Let's continue. So, then tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow who jumped over the moon. Then told me about the dish ran away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the Maroon. So again, we have this use of juxtaposition. And again, Agard is juxtaposing nursery rhyme imagery, the cow who jumped over the moon, the dish who ran away with the spoon, with, again, a significant and highly legitimate figure, someone that should be studied, that should be understood, that has helped Agard to understand his own identity, Nanny the Maroon. More on her in a moment. So we have this juxtaposition of nursery rhyme imagery with legitimate historical figures. And it's used to examine the limitations of the education Agard and his persona have received. Okay, and again, just to comment on it again, because we'll keep coming back against this, we have that anaphora, that repetition, them tell me. And I think the effect of this repetition over the course of the poem increases and adds to that sense of frustration. And it creates that impression that this education is being drummed into him and he has no real opportunities to explore or to question. He's simply being told things. So that repetition creates a building sense of frustration. Creates the sense that his education is drummed into him. He doesn't have the opportunity to challenge or question. He's just told things, and it's repeated over and over and over again, just in the same way that Agard repeats, them tell me, them tell me, them tell me. Okay, so continuing, Nanny the Maroon. So we have again this italicised section of the poem, and Nanny of the Maroons was another really fascinating historical figure. Again, someone entirely worthy of historical study. Again, someone that Agard feels has been pushed aside, has been discounted, has been marginalised within a British curriculum, which again, Agard would argue is Eurocentric and which favours and prioritises a primarily white, primarily British view of history. So, Nanny of the Maroons led a community, essentially, of formerly enslaved Africans to fight in a multi-year war against, again, colonial rule. This time, specifically, British colonial rule in Jamaica. So, she is described... Sorry, I'll note some of that down so we have it here as well. I'll give you a moment to write that down if you've been annotating at home too. So, she led a community of formerly enslaved Africans to fight in a multi-year war against British colonial rule in Jamaica. And again, if you have some time, she is absolutely worth looking into in more depth than we're going to go into today here. But someone who is fascinating, again, incredibly charismatic, strategic, tactical, phenomenally brave, and a really inspirational figure. And she was known at the time for being this inspirational, guiding light. And again, Agard uses this language of vision. She is described as sea-far woman, just like Toussaint is a slave with vision. And we contrast that again with this sense of blinding, and this sense of a loss of sight that is associated with Agard's education. So again, you might comment on the pre-modification, that is the adjective that comes before the noun here, the compound adjective sea-far, the pre-modification of woman with sea-far. Creates the sense that she, like Toussaint L'Ouverture, had vision contrasting Agard's bandaged eyes. Okay, so she's also described again with this language associated with light, but here not quite with the word beacon. She's described as fire woman, and fire has that little bit more of a sense of danger that comes with it as well. Those connotations, perhaps, and again, as Nanny was fighting against British colonial rule, she was engaged in actual battle in a multi-year war. So it has connotations of military struggle as well, perhaps. Fire with connotations of violence and power, but also of light. And again, that sense of hope and struggle and passion. Firewoman struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. So here, this is again how she is being described. It was travelling down this freedom river. She's this hopeful stream. So they're on this journey together. So this is, again, metaphorical language, associating Nanny of the Maroons with freedom. And there's a sense of travel that comes with that as well, as though they're voyaging, they're travelling together. It's a journey towards liberation. Okay, so we come back to this non-italicized section of the poem again here. We're back into these slightly more rigid stanzas with a little bit more of a regular rhyme scheme. Them tell me is repeated again and consistently throughout the poem. We have that use of anaphora. And here, again, we have the use of this juxtaposition of real historical figures and historical events, but again juxtaposing those with another historical figure that Agard doesn't feel that he was taught about, Shaka the Great Zulu. Now, Shaka doesn't even get awarded his own italicized stanza. We have this sense that he's starting to, as he develops his own sense of identity, as he learns more and more about these different figures, there's almost too many to focus on. How is he going to choose between them to what to focus on here? But Shaka the Great Zulu, again, one of the most influential monarchs of the Zulu kingdom, again in the 18th century, a tactical, strategic leader, a brave warrior. So again, an inspirational black historical figure. And now, then tell me about Columbus in 1492. There's the impression that colonial history is being taught, the history of exploration and discovery, and the colonisation of other lands. But he now questions what happens to the native populations, what happens to the indigenous populations, what happens to the people that live in these countries before colonising forces arrived. And tragically, if you look into the histories of these people, what you find is that throughout history they've been subjugated, they've been treated violently, they've been attacked, and they've suffered greatly at the hands of colonial forces which did oppress them. So when he's asking what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks, and he asks specifically the question, what happened to them? Agard is really questioning a curriculum which focuses on the colonizer, so frequently the brutalizer, the inflictor of violence, but that doesn't question, that doesn't explore what happened to the people whose lives were upended and ripped apart by essentially invading forces. So Agard is questioning a curriculum which prioritises stories of colonisers, but which obscures or hides the suffering of those indigenous populations. Whose countries were colonised. And this is a part of history that only in fairly recent years have we begun to fully explore and embed within a British curriculum. When Agard was receiving his education, he feels that this is something that was under-discussed and under-explored and potentially even hidden from sight, something that perhaps was too uncomfortable or too difficult to discuss. So he's challenging again the biases and the limitations of the British educational system and this Eurocentric view of history. All right, continuing. So, then tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp and how Robin Hood used to camp. Then tell me about Old King Cole was a merry old soul, but then never tell me about Mary Seacole. So we have continuation of this repeated juxtaposition. Again, we have the use of anaphora, which I think builds throughout the poem that sense of frustration and irritation and sort of rebellion against this education system. And again, we have the juxtaposition of real historical figures, valid figures for educational study, but also figures from literature and from culture and from fairy tales and children's stories. And again, we have the juxtaposition of those figures alongside that of a valid historical figure, again, a really significant figure within Black history, Mary Seacole, who was a nurse during the Crimean War. And if you're thinking about other poems, the Crimean War is, of course, the one that is the focus of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. So Mary Seacole was a nurse in that era. And again, is someone who has often been under-discussed, despite her really quite significant role and her importance at the time, has been marginalised, has been pushed aside in favour of the study of Florence Nightingale, who was, of course, white. So, from Jamaica, she travelled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go, and even when the British said no, she still braved the Russian snow. So she was denied the opportunity to go through kind of official channels to go and become a nurse during the Crimean War, but went anyway, and was regarded as someone incredibly kind, gentle, helpful, and a really sort of extraordinary figure to aid in the suffering. To aid in the helping the recovery of injured soldiers. So she's described as someone who braves the Russian snow, so emphasising her determination and her fortitude, and emphasising she travelled far, she volunteered to go, she braved the Russian snow. So this is somebody who was determined to go and do what they believed was right, even in the face of barriers being put up and in the face of adversity. So we receive that sense of determination, fortitude, her bravery. And then again we have this beautiful, I think this is some of the most beautiful lines in this poem. We have these associations of Mary Seacole with light. And here she's metaphorically described as a healing star. And that word healing obviously referring to her role as a nurse, but star again is a guiding light. Something that's used to navigate by, something that is used as a way of plotting a journey. So she's described in this way, a healing star, and I think this also has connotations, almost religious connotations, as though she is a heavenly figure, someone who's almost sort of holy in the way that she's being described. A healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. And a yellow sunrise is a really beautiful image, again a metaphor. Again associating her with light. And this time specifically with a sunrise, which is an image of hope, the dawning of a new day. And it's also an image really of beauty. So a yellow sunrise to the dying, offering that sense of solace, offering that sense of comfort, offering that sense of hope. So we looked then at three different key figures overall within this poem. Toussaint L'Ouverture, a slave with vision, the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. Then we have Nanny, the sea-far woman of mountain dream, firewoman struggle. So again, that language of vision, that language of light and hope and inspiration. And then finally, we look at Mary Seacole, the language of light here, a healing star and a yellow sunrise. So throughout the poem, there's this pattern of metaphors that is developed associating these figures with light, which has connotations of optimism, hope and inspiration. And this is how Agard sort of views this, it's almost like a pantheon of heroes, this collection of figures that he views as sources of inspiration, motivation, and that he uses to illuminate his view of the world, that help to aid his vision, his perspective of the world around him. And this is how we come to understand our culture, by understanding our roots, our history, our heritage. This helps to shape our vision of who we are as people. And this is how Agard concludes the poem, by returning to this idea of identity. So we have again, finally, that repetition, again that use of anaphora. Them tell me what them want to tell me. And then Agard uses that word but to offer this counterpoint, this rebellion against the education that he has been receiving. Now I'm checking out my own history. I'm carving out my identity. So now he is exploring his own history by studying the lives of these Black historical figures. And in doing so, he carves out his identity. And I love the use of this word, carving. When we've studied this in class, some of my favourite conversations that I've listened to have been around Agard's use of metaphorical language within this poem. And I think this metaphor here, the fact that he's carving out his identity, has this sense of real craftsmanship to it, as though there is an artistry in what he's doing, as though his identity, when it is fully constructed, will be a thing of beauty, a work of art, something that is inspirational and something that is hopeful and optimistic and influenced and informed by all of these figures that he's chosen to study. Okay. So again, we finished at around about the half an hour mark. I hope that that was useful. And again, hope that that was a nice refresher for those of you that have studied this poem before and going back over some of these figures and who they are. While this poem is one of the longest in the collection, I think it's a real gift in terms of one that you can analyse. There's so many different methods that you can use to talk about, so many fantastic historical allusions that you can use to really demonstrate the breadth of your knowledge. So thank you very much again. If you've made it all the way to the end of that, well, very well done, and thank you for your patience and for your hard work. So happy revising.